All right. This is going to be the last part of Chapter 13. It's going to cover basically Andrew Jackson's war against the bank through Texas independence. So the bank itself, the Bank of the United States, as it says right here, is the most powerful bank, right? Acted almost as a branch of the government. It served an important purpose, but the problem was, is we've read before, it was initially run very poorly. Nicholas Biddle is going to be the head of the bank, right? Some people saw him as having too much power. Also, some people saw it as a sin against the egalitarian credo of American democracy, basically meaning that the bank served the elite and not the common man. And remember, that's a big thing in this chapter, is the idea of the rise of the common man and the masses, if you will. Belief formed deepest source of Jackson's opposition. Bank won no friends in the West because of foreclosures on that land that people had speculated to buy to grow cotton or whatever with the Panic of 1819. And profit, not public service, was its first priority. So that's clearly going to be a conflict of interest. So Webster and Clay are going to support a new charter. Remember, both of them are nationalists, right? That idea of the American system. Okay, that's going to be big. Also, as it says right here, the charter wasn't going to end until 1816, but they were trying to get it renewed in 1832 so they could kind of sneak it in there. And he also wanted to go through Congress and then send it to the White House. Now, he knew this would hurt Jackson, right? So Jackson, if he vetoed it, right, would be losing support anywhere, or if he supported it, he'd be losing support. But Jackson didn't care. As you can imagine from Jackson, he's a man of principle, and he vetoes the recharter. As we've already read in McCulloch v. Maryland, the Supreme Court stating the Supremacy Clause and the Implied Powers Clause of the Constitution is going to support the creation of the bank. The consequences of the veto, it showed the strength of the presidency. He found that the bank was harmful for the nation, and thus claimed for presidential power a power equal to 2/3 the vote of Congress, because that's how much is needed to overturn a presidential veto. Now, in 1832, we're going to have another election. Henry Clay is going to come back, and he's going to run against Andrew Jackson. Now, this is going to be the first time we also see a third party. Oftentimes, third parties are for certain interests. So in this instance, it's the Masons. So the anti-Mason party will pop up, and it will be the first, right? The first third party. Since Jackson was a Mason, the anti-Masons were also anti-Jackson. There were 3 national nominating conventions for this time. Yet again, we're making more and more steps towards our modern system. Still, there was no primary system, though. Anti-Masons and National Republicans added formal platforms publicizing positions and issues. I think it's recording over. I apologize, guys. But real quick, Jackson trounces Clay, as you can see right here. And yet again, Jackson was a idol of the masses, which allowed him to defeat the ever-spending Henry Clay. Clay's going to run 5 times, right, and lose all 5. Here's Jackson, right? I guess that's supposed to be Clay. I'm not exactly sure. Oh no, excuse me. That's Biddle, the guy that runs the bank, and this is Van Buren. Your frontiersman or Davy Crockett kind of looking guy. And yet again exemplifies the fight with the bank. So, its charter denied the bank was due to expire in 1836, but Jackson was out to kill it much sooner than that. So what he does is he removes all of the money out of the bank, and he puts it into what we refer to as pet banks. Pet banks are going to be state-run or individual banks that aren't going to have any oversight. And so to kill a bank, if it has no deposits, it can't, loan any money, and it won't make any money, and thus cease to exist. So he really creates. And one aspect of moving out all of the deposits was he had to find a Treasury Secretary willing to do it. So Jackson's actually going to move one out of office, put somebody in that he thinks is going to be helpful for him, and then fire him. And eventually, on the third guy, the guy will agree to remove the funds, because removing of the funds was like suicide for the bank. And as I said before, they were placed in pet banks, right? Without the central control, these pet banks were often fly-by-night operations, and they invested the money poorly, kind of like when we looked at the what it was called. We were talking about that fractional reserve banking, right? And the idea of loaning out the money, keeping a portion of it. Well, they would loan out large amounts, not keep it, give out bad loans, and eventually go out of business. Jackson tried to rein in the runaway economy with the specie circular, which basically said if you're going to buy land, it had to be on hard money. Well, there wasn't very much hard money, and it was easy to create credit, as we talked about with the fractional banking system part. It's easy to create credit with paper money. So this basically slammed the brakes on all of land speculation, and it contributed to this panic in 1837. So the Democratic Republicans, which are Jackson's party, are going to form the name of the Democrats, where we get them today, and the Whigs, created by Jackson's opponents, right, because of the idea of him as a king, and they were going to be anti-king, so they took the name of the British party, the Whigs. They first emerged in the Senate, Henry Clay, Webster, and Calhoun, right? Jackson's famous words were that he wished he had shot Clay and hung Calhoun, right? Joined forces in 1834 to pass a motion censoring Jackson. Basically, a censure is a public sort of reprimand of the president, right? There's nothing actually that happens to the president, but it's like basically shows that Congress doesn't like what you're doing. And he believes he's the only president to be censured. And this, is in response to moving out the stuff from the bank. Banknote from the time period, right? Remember, they're going to be issued by banks and not the federal government. Others are going to weigh in on this. Supporters of Clay's American system, Southern states writers and Northern industrials and merchants and many evangelical Protestant all joined the Whigs. Whigs saw themselves as conservative, but were progressive in support of active government programs and reforms. So, yet again, you can't equate this time period's parties with the present parties. They wanted internal improvements, right? They're going to want a bank. They're going to want basically all the stuff for the American system, like we've talked about. They absorbed that anti-Masonic party, right? And they tried to claim they defended the common man, and that the Democrats were for cronyism, right? The spoil system that we talked about earlier. So Van Buren, right, was Jackson's confidant, part of the kitchen cabinet, like we talked about. He is going to be his chosen successor for 1836, and basically he will rig the convention to make sure Van Buren gets it, and then Jackson supports Van Buren, and the Whigs, unable to nominate a single candidate, will then have their vote split. So each with different regional appeal, right? Scatter votes with no one candidate could win the majority. The deadlock would be decided by the U.S. House, where the Whigs had a chance. So yet again, Henry Clay in the House. Whig's favorite son, William Henry Harrison of Ohio, the Battle of Tippecanoe, right? Versus the Little Magician, right? Our Dutch-speaking Martin Van Buren. And Van Buren's going to win on a popular vote there and the electoral vote here. Van Buren is going to be a clever guy, right? As it points out right here. He's going to be handicapped, though, right? Because he was basically elected by a political machine, by the protocol of the Democrats. Excuse me, of the Whigs. And so he's going to face the ire of a lot of the Democrats and people. He's also going to have all of Jackson's enemies gunning for him as well. So some of the problems he walked in on, right, is the economic problems thanks to Jackson and the bank and how he mishandled that. Also, the expansion problems that we've talked about in class. The idea of if we add Texas, if we add that land, what do we do with it for slavery? Well, the anti-slavery people basically were so vehement against the annexation because they didn't want to spread slavery, and if Texas was going to come in, it's going to want slavery. And so he really had to sort of balance the question over the annexation of Texas, which he doesn't. He passes on that. And he tries to handle this economic issue. There's going to be a panic in 1837. Speculative banks, right? We talked about. Besides these speculative banks, the failures in agriculture, Jackson's mishandling are all going to be what lead to the 1837 panic. Big British banks are going to fail, and as it says right here, hardship was acute and widespread, meaning it hurt a lot and a lot of people felt it. So hundreds of American banks close, commodity prices, so like prices of wheat and cotton, that kind of thing, drop. Sale of public lands fell off because nobody had the money to buy them. And then factories closed because nobody was buying their stuff, so they had to lay the workers off, which compounds the problem. So how to deal with this? Well, Clay and the Whigs are going to say active government stuff, right? Like we need to make the banks have more credit, issue higher taxes, and keep this, subsidize it, make this American system go. Van Buren's is going to say no, and he's going to call for an independent treasury, part of the divorce bill there. Now, as it says right there, by establishing this so-called independent treasury, they are going to lock away the government's money in vaults, right? Basically, the idea was the treasury was now not, it was independent, meaning that the government and it were separate, right? And so then they would hopefully be able to hold on to the money, but it's not always necessarily good because we talked about the ideas of issuing credit and loans and that kind of thing. In this system, they would not be able to do that. So this independent treasury is going to go back and forth. It's going to, after a close vote, it's going to pass in 1840, then it's going to be repealed in 41, and then brought back in 46, and it'll stay that way until the network of national banks created by the Republican Party during the Civil War, which we read about in the history of banking. So, Texas. 1821, you get Mexican independence. 1823, Stephen F. Austin, started by his father actually, but Stephen F. Austin will get the land grant to bring in the original 300 settlers, 300 settling families into Texas. The thing was, they had to basically swear an oath to Mexico to become Catholic, as it says, be Mexicanized, that sort of thing was a sworn oath. And also they had to agree not to have slavery. So about 30,000 by 1835, most law-abiding, but some left states just ahead of the sheriff, meaning that they were chased out by the government. Gone to Texas became descriptive slang. Among their settlers were Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. Later ex-governor of Tennessee, Sam Houston. Pioneer individuals who came to Texas were not easy to push around. Okay. So in 1830, right, Mexico tries to clamp down on slavery. Also, they realize that they're getting overrun by these American settlers that are not adopting to becoming Mexicanized or whatever it was said. And also, they weren't becoming Roman Catholic, and they weren't doing all these sorts of things. So as it says right here, Texas refused to honor these decrees, and they kept bringing in slaves and new settlers and really kind of ignoring Mexico. They're going to send Stephen F. Austin, right, to Mexico City in 1833 to negotiate the differences. Santa Anna is going to jail him for 8 months. And then in 1835, Santa Anna is going to basically declare dictatorship over Texas and raise an army to go suppress Texas. So, having been students probably in the state of Texas already, you've taken a lot of Texas history, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. But in 1836, we declare independence. This 6,000-man army, as we'll see, is going to sweep into Texas. It's going to come in two prongs. The two famous defeats in this, right, are at the Alamo and at Goliad. And so they get the battle cries, remember the Alamo, remember Goliad, which come into play at San Jacinto. Another famous battle is the Battle of Gonzales, where they go to capture the little cannon in the town. It probably wasn't even as big as this picture has it, and it really wasn't super viable, but it represented power of the town against the Mexico, so they had to come and claim it. And so they held out against the Mexicans and created the now famous flag, the come and take it flag, very similar to Leonidas' response to Xerxes at the Battle of Thermopylae. They want my weapons, feel free to come and get them. Also, famous battle image here of the Battle of the Alamo. You got Davy Crockett, right? Jim Bowie's probably over here somewhere dying in his bed. And the idea, right, due to overwhelming numbers, right, the Alamo falls, which is sort of ends up being a battle cry, as I pointed out earlier. Now, slain heroes, right, become legendary. Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad, death to Santa Anna. People flock to help the Texans. Now, Houston is going to adopt George Washington's method of battle, I guess, or MO, if you will. He's going to kind of retreat, forcing the Mexicans to follow him until eventually he gets in a situation at San Jacinto that he likes. And as we'll see, the age-old thing was that they were at their afternoon siesta, and he attacks. Santa Anna supposedly tried to escape and was dressed as, like, I've heard different accounts that he was dressed as a woman or as a like private in the army, all these different things, but somebody saluted him, kind of giving him away. And eventually he's going to be forced to sign the treaty. Now, as I said before, the two prongs, not a ton of victories, as you'll notice, for the Texians. Now, in the treaty to end the battle, we're going to have the Mexican troops withdraw. The Rio Grande is the southern border of Texas and northern border of Mexico. Santa Anna, following his release, will basically repudiate the treaty, basically saying that he did not really mean it, but that since he was under duress, meaning that he was being threatened, that he agreed to it. This is going to set up the groundwork for the Mexican-American War, which we're going to see in a couple chapters. The United States overwhelmingly favored Texas, but the question of adding Texas was going to be the tough part. So even though Jackson kind of wanted to, he didn't want to deal with the issues of adding Texas. And so in 1837, when he's leaving office, he does extend recognition to the Lone Star Republic, showing that they do exist and they have a right to exist. Many of the people in Texas fought for independence for basically the right to join the United States, right? And if you think about the title, the Lone Star, right? Meaning we're a star and we want to be added to your flag kind of idea. So we've petitioned for annexation, right? But the question over slavery was going to be too much, even though most of the people that settled in Texas were originally from the South and Southwest United States. Many Texans were slaveholders and admitted to Texas to the Union. It meant greatly enlarging American slavery. So it's going to be basically stall out the annexation until we get to, I believe, President Polk. So 1840, Democrats going to nominate Van Buren again. Whigs, only one candidate this time, William Henry Harrison. Whigs, as a result of the Democratic editor's insult, right, adopt their hard cider and log cabin campaign. Basically, the Whigs try to make William Henry Harrison out to be a more common man, that he lives in a log cabin and drinks hard cider, while Martin Van Buren is this aristocrat thinker guy versus their basic version of Andrew Jackson. There's a famous towel, or I'm not sure what it is because the thing's behind it, handkerchief, I guess, about living in a log cabin and drinking hard cider. It was as it says right here, is a masterpiece of inane hoopla because none of it was true about Harrison. He was one of the first families of Virginia, meaning he came from a very well-to-do family that lived in Virginia. And he won, yet again, a surprisingly close margin, another one-term president for Van Buren. Whigs are going to come in and try to stimulate the economy, right? They're going to get rid of the independent treasury like we already talked about. Democrats favored retrenchment and to end the high-flying banks and aggressive corporations. Here's a famous picture or pull card at the beginning, right? It's Martin Van Buren, as you can see here on his cup. You pull the cup out, and you can see the William Henry Harrison hard cider that he drank there was not tasting very well for him. So the politics of the people here, 1840 election demonstrated two major changes in politics since the era of good feelings. First was the triumph of populist democratic style, meaning that more people could vote. Politicians were forced to curry favor with the masses. It was no longer an elitist type thing. Wealthy and prominent had to forsake social pretensions and cultivate common touch if they hoped to win elections. The common man was now at the center of national politics. And so the idea was, right, that people now mattered more. In the image here, it highlights the drunkenness and drinking associated with the country election. Also, strangely enough, the secret ballot was not common at this point, and so most of the time people actually had to stand up and say who they were voting for. So eventually the ideas of the secret ballot and the Australian ballot come about. So second dramatic change for the formation of the two Vickers party system. Jeffersonian so successful in absorbing the Federalist programs that two trade person never emerged. So it was like the Federalists kind of ceased to exist right around the time that it really should have got going. So this might be the beginning. Is the beginning really of the modern two parties. Ideas still prevailed that parties equal conspiracy and faction and injured the health of a virtuous republic. So on one side, you have the idea that the party system allows for competition, thus balancing each other out, or the idea that it causes factionalism and people are going to be more concerned with that, and then what is the best for the country. Both parties are going to grow out of republicanism, right? The Democrats start off as Democratic Republicans. The Whigs were National Republicans. The Democrats glorified liberty of the individual and guarded against privilege, while the Whigs wanted a larger nation, right, where an active government and berated leaders who appealed to self-interests. Democrats, states' rights, we're going to see this yet again through the Civil War even, and Whigs, yet again, national stuff. Separated by real differences in philosophy and policy, but have much in common, okay? Mass appeal, parties mobilized many voters as possible. Social and geographic diversity within each encouraged compromise and avoided creation of sectional parties. When we see this creation of sectional parties is when we see stuff for the Civil War. All right. This is the end of this lecture. Make sure to answer those questions, and I will see you guys in class.